For 30 years, one raised hand could end a dream, and one cold sentence could change a life. America knew Simon Cowell as the most feared man on television, a judge who could crush hope with a look and make millions wait for his verdict. But life has a savage way of judging the judge. Far from the screaming crowds and blinding studio lights, the man who built his power on control was suddenly lying helpless on an operating table. A violent accident broke his back in several places. 6 hours of surgery followed. A metal rod was fixed into his spine, and for the first time in his life, Simon Cowell faced a verdict he could not interrupt, soften, or overturn. His own body might never obey him the same way again. Today, at 66, the fiercest judge in entertainment is no longer protected by the armor that made him famous. Behind the scowl is a man forced to confront the one truth: money, power, and authority cannot silence, that life does not care who is holding the microphone. Before we step behind the curtain of Simon Cowell's most brutal reckoning, subscribe and leave a few words for the man behind the verdict. A boarding school corridor can make a child feel smaller than he is. Shoes move in order, doors open on schedule, voices lower when an adult enters. Somewhere in that line stands Simon Cowell, slightly apart, already uncomfortable with the idea that obedience should come before judgment. He was born in London on October 7, 1959, and raised in Hertfordshire in a household with stability, expectations, and access to the adult world. His mother, Julie, had worked in dance and performance. His father, Eric Cowell, built his career in property and later held responsibilities connected to EMI. There was food on the table, discipline in the home, and a future that could have followed a respectable path. Simon's difficulty began inside that order. Rules arrived before they made sense to him, and once a rule felt empty, his patience disappeared. At schools including Dover College, he struggled with the structure around him. Other boys learned where to stand, when to speak, and how to pass through the day without drawing attention. Simon did not turn resistance into glamour. It made ordinary life harder. Teachers saw a pupil who would not settle. Institutions saw a young man whose temperament did not fit their design. A school report could reduce him to conduct and compliance. The bell still rang. The line still moved. Simon remained the boy who seemed to arrive in the wrong shape for the life prepared around him. At home, the contrast was quieter. Eric moved with the steadiness of a man who understood responsibility. Simon carried the restlessness of someone already looking beyond the chair in which he was sitting. Julie's history and performance placed another world nearby, one shaped by instinct, timing, and the strange power of being noticed. Simon grew up between those influences. One parent represented practical survival. The other had known the pull of the stage. He absorbed pieces of both and belonged completely to neither. Formal education offered a marked road. Simon left it early, and university never became his destination. Friends moved toward qualifications and established careers. Simon moved toward work, still searching for a place where impatience might become useful instead of punishable. Eric eventually helped him enter EMI through the mailroom. The gesture mattered because of its limits. His starting point was a mailbag and a place at the bottom of the building's hierarchy. Day after day, he carried envelopes along corridors where decisions were being made behind closed doors. He passed framed records he had not helped create, and meeting rooms he had not been invited to enter. Years later, millions would wait for his judgment. In those early days, he was the young man standing outside while other people gave theirs. Carrying messages soon became unbearable when he wanted to choose the music, shape the deal, and decide what reached the public. Eric had opened the lowest door in the building. Simon was already looking toward the rooms above it, unaware that the first structure he tried to build for himself would one day collapse beneath him. The mailbag eventually gave way to demo tapes, publishing agreements, and the first chance to sit in rooms where music was discussed before the public heard it. Simon moved through early work in publishing and artist development with the impatience that had followed him since school. Carrying out another person's decision held little attraction. He wanted the risk that came with making the decision himself. That desire pulled him away from EMI and towards smaller ventures where authority arrived faster and protection disappeared with it. By the middle of the 1980s, he was working with Ian Burton to build Fanfare Records. The office was modest, the ambitions large. Every record carried the possibility of escape from being someone else's employee. Every call could bring a distributor, a retailer, a radio station, or another refusal. Simon had finally reached the side of the business where choices were made, though the ground beneath him was far less secure than it appeared. Sunita became central to that first period of momentum. Their lives crossed personally as well as professionally, and the two were connected by youth, affection, work, and the uncertainty of trying to build careers before either could know what would last. So Macho needed persistence before it found its audience. When it broke through, the record gave Simon the proof he had been waiting for. It was bright, immediate, commercial, and difficult to ignore. Orders rose. Radio play increased. The young executive, who had once delivered other people's mail, could now hear one of his own decisions moving through shops and homes. Sunita's performance and image were part of what the public embraced. Simon's role was to recognize the possibility and push it into the marketplace. For a time, Fanfare looked like the independent future he had wanted. The office held movement. The staff had work. Success made the days faster. It also created a dangerous illusion that one strong instinct could protect an entire company from every weakness beneath it. Then the sound thinned. Fanfare had a hit, yet its foundation could not support the future Simon had attached to it. Business weakened. Agreements failed to arrive. Releases fell short. People who once entered without warning began to stay away. By the end of the decade, the company had collapsed, and Simon had lost much of the financial ground he had built. The public image of the young music entrepreneur no longer matched the private reality of a man near 30, reducing his life and returning to his parents' home. A bag placed on the floor carried more weight than any balance sheet. He had once left with the impatience of a son eager to control his own life. He came back with fewer choices and the knowledge that his first attempt at independence had failed. Eric needed no speech across the dinner table. The familiar staircase, the old bedroom, and the sound of his parents moving through the house said enough. So Macho remained evidence that Simon could recognize a hit. Fanfare remained evidence that recognition alone could not hold a company together. Morning still arrived, and the industry continued without waiting for his pride to recover. Simon began again, from a lower position than the one he thought he had earned. A stack of demo tapes can look identical until one of them changes a career. Simon returned to the music business through BMG with far less room for vanity. The end of Fanfare had stripped away the glamour of owning a label and left him with the work itself, listening, comparing, calculating, and deciding whether an ordinary household would care enough to spend money. In a quiet office, he could play the same recording again and wait for the instant when familiarity became desire. Critics had their own language. The public answered through behavior. They turned up the radio. They asked to shop for the record. They remembered a melody after hearing it once. Simon began to rebuild around those actions. He paid attention to familiar songs, television personalities, novelty projects, and performers whose appeal could be dismissed by people seeking prestige. The choice required discipline. Commercial music still had to reach a listener at the exact point where recognition became attachment. A face, A voice, a melody, and a story had to meet in the right order. Robson Green and Jerome Flynn gave him a powerful example. Their popularity had already entered British homes through television, and their recordings offered listeners voices and songs that felt familiar before the first purchase. When Robson and Jerome became a major commercial success, Simon recovered more than professional standing. He regained the confidence to defend an idea in a room where others doubted it. Once the sales figures arrived, opinion became paper. He learned to read the charts without treating them as permanent. A high position could validate one decision and disappear a week later. A familiar face could attract attention, yet the record still had to hold the listener after recognition faded. Simon watched how families consumed entertainment together, how television could create trust before a song reached a shop, and how a direct emotional promise often traveled farther than critical approval. Many listeners wanted music tied to memory, romance, reassurance, or the pleasure of welcoming a familiar voice into their homes. Some heard calculation in his choices. Simon heard a form of connection that the industry often overlooked. By the late 1990s, that method found one of its clearest expressions in Westlife. The group offered strong voices, youth, carefully chosen ballads, and a form of emotional familiarity that could travel from radio into family living rooms. Simon was one figure among managers, writers, producers, executives, and the performers themselves. His belief in the group fit the pattern he had spent years refining. Westlife emerged through selection, arrangement, presentation, and the long discipline of understanding what large audiences returned to again and again. Their early success marked the moment when Simon's rebuilt career began to look stronger than the one he had lost. The charts rose. The group moved toward the center of popular music. Simon had reached the kind of victory that makes an old failure seem distant. Then, another piece of news arrived, and the distance vanished. The good news should have been enough to fill the day. Westlife had reached a major chart milestone, and Simon had the result he had spent years trying to earn. The road from the EMI mailroom, through the fall of fanfare, and back into the industry had finally produced a victory large enough to feel undeniable. Near that moment came the news that his father, Eric Cowell, had died in 1999 after a heart attack. Simon later spoke about the painful closeness of those events. Success arrived. Loss stood beside it. Eric had known every earlier version of his son, the restless boy, the young employee, the ambitious founder, the man who returned home carrying less than he had taken away. Simon's career had changed repeatedly under his father's gaze. Now, the result that seemed to gather those years into one answer had nowhere to land. The family home kept its shape while its oldest rhythm disappeared. The furniture remained, the same cups could still be placed on the table. Yet the person Simon had wanted to tell was gone. Eric had seen him begin at the bottom. He had seen him fail. He had seen him stand up again. The final proof came after time had closed. Outside, Westlife's success continued to grow. Inside, one voice had vanished from the family's daily pattern. A chart result could confirm that Simon had been right about music. It could not return the ordinary exchange he had carried in his mind for years. Television opened almost immediately afterward. Pop Idol placed Simon before the public, where his directness and ability to make a fast judgment became central to the program. American Idol carried that image into millions of homes across the United States. The raised eyebrow, the long pause, and the clipped verdict turned him into a television figure larger than his record company role. The X Factor and Britain's Got Talent expanded the scale. One studio led to another. One season became a franchise. A red light came on above the camera, and Simon was expected to be alert, exact, and entertaining. The schedule left little room for stillness. When the audience filled the theater, People wanted a decision from him. When the applause faded, the result he most wanted to reverse remained beyond his reach. Simon continued because another performer was waiting. From the outside, his composure looked complete. Inside the shape of his success, one place remained permanently unoccupied. A ring can make a future look settled long before two people have learned how to live inside it. Simon's relationships during the years of his greatest television power unfolded beside calendars crowded with flights, auditions, production meetings, and long separations between London and Los Angeles. Terry Seymour, a journalist and television presenter with a career of her own, shared roughly 6 years of that life with him. Their relationship existed across cities and schedules, often inside the narrow spaces left by work. A dinner depended on a return flight. A weekend could be shortened by another production date. The world saw red carpets and photographs of two successful people moving through glamorous rooms. A shared life required quieter hours, mornings without a departure time, meals allowed to run late, and the certainty that both people were moving toward the same home. Simon spoke during those years with little certainty about marriage or fatherhood. His life had been arranged around mobility, work, and control. Permanence required another rhythm. Terry's future could not remain an open space while Simon decided when he might be ready to enter it. Their relationship ended in 2008, and both lives continued. The calendar remained crowded. Flights still departed. Terry returned to her own work and identity, which had never depended solely on Simon's presence. Mejgan Hosseini entered another period in which Simon appeared closer to commitment. Their engagement brought a ring into public view and gave the impression that his long hesitation might finally be ending. The ring became clearer than the wedding plans. Months passed, and the future implied by the object never became a ceremony. Mejgan had her own career, history, and dignity. The end of the engagement did not require one person to carry all the blame. Intention and daily life had stopped moving together. On television, Simon could watch a group for a few minutes and decide whether the chemistry worked. At home, compatibility unfolded across years, habits, travel, and the difficult question of how much of his life he was prepared to rearrange. Two impressive houses could still fail to become the same home. Simon continued to believe that change could wait until the right moment appeared. The moment that altered him would arrive without asking whether he was ready. The news arrived through a call, small enough to fit inside an ordinary day and heavy enough to divide several lives. Simon had known Lauren and Andrew Silverman socially for years. Lauren was still married to Andrew, and they were raising their son Adam when her pregnancy with Simon's child became public in 2013. The exact beginning of Simon and Lauren's private relationship remained known only to those closest to them. What became visible was the aftermath. Photographers gathered. Newspapers turned a pregnancy into daily judgment. At the same time, legal documents carried the names of two parents whose marriage was ending. Andrew released a restrained statement centered on protecting his young son. Lauren also asked for privacy while she and Andrew worked through the separation. Outside, restraint had already disappeared. A family matter had become public property, reduced to dates, photographs, and conclusions made by strangers. Lauren carried the child while carrying the end of her marriage in full public view. More than a decade later, she called that pregnancy one of the hardest times of my life. She spoke of wishing the circumstances had unfolded differently, and of the pain caused to Andrew, Adam, and others around them. The acknowledgement did not remove responsibility. It gave the months a human voice. A medical appointment could end with cameras outside. A quiet morning could begin with her name spread across a newspaper. Andrew remained Adam's father, trying to protect a child old enough to understand that the adults around him were under pressure. Simon also admitted that he was not proud of how the relationship began. The admission offered no clean repair. It sat beside the damage rather than replacing it. Then a black and white image appeared on a medical screen. Simon had spoken for years as a man who did not see fatherhood in his future. The scan gave that future a shape. The screen filled the quiet more completely than any audience or soundtrack could have done. It held the grainy outline of a child who had not yet entered the world. Simon later said that seeing the image changed him immediately. Affection arrived before the first cry. Mixed with consequences, affection could not erase. Eric Philip Cowell was born in New York on February 14, 2014. Simon reached the city before the birth. Under the hospital lights, the noise surrounding the pregnancy narrowed to a newborn and the careful movements of the staff around him. The baby was given the name Eric, carried from Simon's family into another generation. The public saw photographs of a famous man looking down at his son with an expression softer than the face millions knew from television. The private frame remained wider. Andrew and Lauren's marriage had ended. Adam was adjusting to a changed family. Lauren had passed through a pregnancy shadowed by scrutiny. Simon had entered fatherhood through circumstances he would later acknowledge had hurt others. The child in his arms carried none of that responsibility. A new family had begun, while another learned a different shape. Simon's mother, Julie, lived long enough to see her restless son hold a child of his own. Their shared time would last little more than a year. A production calendar is designed to absorb disruption. Audition dates are fixed. The theater is booked. Contestants travel with songs prepared and numbers pinned to their clothes. On July 6, 2015, the Manchester auditions for The X Factor were due to begin. Instead, the date was cancelled. Simon's mother, Julie Cowell, had died the previous day at the age of 89. The machinery stopped. Thousands of performers could wait. Simon's family could not move the day to another place on the calendar. Julie had known Simon before the black shirts, the television franchises, and the rooms that fell silent when he raised one hand. She had known the impatient boy at the dinner table, the young man who left formal education early, and the son who kept searching for work that could hold his attention. Fame added layers around that person. A mother's memory reached beneath all of them. During the final year of her life, she also knew Simon as a father. Eric was still a baby, young enough to be carried from one person to another, young enough for every family visit to require bottles, blankets, and an adult hand supporting his head. In the photographs from that brief period, 3 generations could occupy the same frame. Julie had spent decades watching her son hurry toward the future. Now, she could watch him slow down for a child. The time was painfully short. Eric had been born in February 2014. Julie was gone by July 2015. She would never hear his older voice, watch him enter school, or see the personality that would emerge as he grew. The loss lived in ordinary futures that had seemed available only months earlier. Birthdays with another place at the table. Visits in which a grandmother noticed how much the child had changed. Photographs that might have recorded the years instead of one brief beginning. The family home still held familiar rooms and objects, yet its oldest rhythm had ended. Julie had been the last person who could look at Simon Cowell, the global television figure, and remember the child before the world knew his name. When she died, that witness disappeared. Television had trained audiences to expect a result. A performer stood under the lights, Simon spoke, and uncertainty ended. His mother's absence allowed neither a return appearance nor a second chance. The cancelled auditions made that truth visible for a day. Work would resume because hundreds of people depended on it. Contestants would come back. The stage would light again. Simon could still travel to the family home, yet the person who made it feel like the place of his childhood would no longer be there. He now returned to Lauren and to a small boy still learning how to speak, carrying the responsibility of becoming the parent whose presence would shape another childhood. One home preserved the years when Simon had been somebody's son. The other waited for him to become somebody's father. Between them stood a photograph of 3 generations, complete for only a moment. The electric bike lay on its side at Simon's Malibu home. Moments earlier, he had been testing the powerful machine with his family nearby. Then, the movement ended. Simon had injured his back in several places. He was taken to a hospital, where surgeons used a metal rod and screws to stabilize the damage. Later, he said, "I knew I had broken my back the minute I landed." The man whose public image depended on remaining composed now faced the most basic movements as separate tasks: turning, sitting upright, lowering his feet, standing. On television, Simon could stop an act with one hand. In recovery, his body followed a slower authority. The hospital bed held him in place. A handrail mattered more than any judging desk. Every short walk required attention that he had once reserved for a major production. The most exposed part of the experience appeared when he thought about Eric. Simon later described feeling embarrassed about returning home, unable to walk normally, with metal inside his back, and wondering how his son would understand what had happened. Lauren prepared Eric before he came in. Simon was lying in bed when the boy looked at him and compared him to Iron Man. The words were simple. They turned the metal from a sign of damage into something a child could accept. Eric saw his father reduced in movement and answered without fear. Recovery was measured in feet rather than ratings. Exercises replaced meetings. Simon had spent decades training himself to make immediate judgments. Healing refused immediacy. A therapist could give instructions. His muscles still had to perform them. The first steps were cautious and supported. His hand closed around a rail. His weight shifted. A hallway that once required no thought became a distance to be completed. When he returned to America's Got Talent, the desk and lights looked unchanged. Simon did not. The body beneath the familiar black shirt carried metal and memory. In 2022, another electric bike accident in London injured his arm. He appeared afterward with a cast, offering the public reassurance through a smile. Privately, another routine movement had been taken away for a time. Simon also began speaking more openly about his changing face, admitting that he had gone too far with facial fillers and had stopped using them. The man who had judged presentation for years was beginning to look at his own reflection with less appetite for correction. He could still raise a hand and stop the music. Pain obeyed no signal. His body had become a fact he could no longer push to the edge of his life. The change appeared first in objects that stopped demanding his attention. For most of Simon's adult life, a telephone had carried sales numbers, ratings, production problems, and decisions that seemed unable to wait until morning. Over time, the device began to disappear from his hand. Lauren said, in 2026, that Simon had lived for about 8 years without regularly using a personal cell phone. Simon once compared carrying one all the time to having a toaster with you. At dinner, the table no longer needed to hold a glowing screen beside the plates. At night, work could remain unanswered until daylight. The silence was chosen. Simon's temperament remained recognizable. He still competed, revised, interrupted, searched, and listened for weaknesses other people preferred to overlook. Fatherhood did not erase the executive who wanted another take, or the judge willing to say that a performance had failed. It changed the hours around that person. A child grows according to a schedule. No producer can pause. Shoes become too small. A voice deepens. A school year ends. The father who misses those changes cannot order them repeated. Simon began protecting more evenings and allowing family routines to occupy space that work once consumed almost completely. Eric sometimes joined him at America's Got Talent, standing near the wings where the stage lights were visible without placing him at the center of them. Simon watched his son watch the acts. A child's face offered a response before language complicated it. Attention, boredom, delight, confusion. Simon began treating Eric's reaction as a measure of whether a performance could reach younger viewers. The exchange reversed their expected roles. Simon had spent decades teaching artists how audiences might respond. Beside the stage, his son quietly taught him where attention still lived. Their collaboration also moved into a smaller creative space through Wish Fits, a proposed series of children's books built from playful animal combinations. The project never needed to stand beside Simon's television achievements to matter. Its value lived in the process. A father listening to his son's ideas without a score, a ranking, or a winner. Lauren became part of the steadier rhythm around them. Public photographs still placed the family at premieres and events, yet daily life rested in repetition. Shared meals, school decisions, travel arranged around a child, and the small negotiations required to keep a home functioning while Simon moved between productions. Their history could not be rewritten. Daily presence became the language available to them now. The most meaningful changes rarely announced themselves. A phone stayed dark. A work call waited. Eric stood beside the stage instead of watching his father leave for another airport. After filming, Simon could walk away with Lauren and their son toward a life where no one needed a verdict. Presence remained imperfect, interrupted by ambition and habit. Still, it had become part of the life he protected. The red light above the camera still comes on, and Simon Cowell still knows exactly where to look. At 66, he has not retired. He continues to appear on Britain's Got Talent and America's Got Talent, returning to the judging desk that turned his pauses, expressions, and carefully measured verdicts into part of television history. A generation that first watched him on American Idol has grown older with him. Some now hear his voice from the same living rooms where their children once waited for the results. Simon has also returned to the kind of work that first gave him influence, finding unknown young performers and trying to shape them into a group the public may remember. Simon Cowell, the next act, followed that search and led to December 10th, a new boy band beginning to release music and perform for audiences. Their future remains unwritten. Simon understands the distance between a promising beginning and a career that survives changing taste, changing technology, and the impatience of a public always ready to move toward the next voice. The young singers are entering an industry ruled by streaming, short videos, and attention that can disappear within seconds. Simon brings instincts formed in another era, when a record had to earn its way into shops, radio stations, and family homes. In meetings, he remains exacting. In rehearsals, he still listens for the weak note, the uncertain harmony, and the moment when confidence slips. Yet each working day eventually ends. The performers return to their own families, and Simon returns to a 12-year-old son old enough to understand that the severe man seen on television and the father waiting at home are the same person. Lauren remains beside him as his fiancée and longtime partner. Their life contains fewer certainties than a television format and more reasons to leave work unfinished. Eric is now reaching the age when childhood begins to retreat in visible ways. His shoes grow larger, his opinions sharpen, his interests begin to belong entirely to him. Simon can offer guidance, experience, access, and protection, yet he cannot slow the years or ask for a missed season to be recorded again. That knowledge gives ordinary time a different weight. A meal at home, a conversation after school, or a quiet ride away from a studio can carry more meaning than another set of ratings. On camera, Simon still occupies the position of authority. A contestant finishes. The audience settles. He leans toward the microphone and gives the answer everyone has been waiting for. His words may open a door or close one. Then the recording ends. Crew members gather cables. The bright surface of the set loses its glow. The theater empties row by row until applause becomes the ordinary sound of people leaving. Simon rises from the place that defined him and walks into the quiet beyond the stage. A new group may flourish or fade. Another season may be renewed. His body may allow years of work or ask him to move more carefully. The future carries no producer's guarantee. Simon has spent much of his life arranging moments in which ordinary people step into the light and ask to be chosen. Age has placed a quieter choice before him: how much of himself to leave beneath those lights, and how much to carry home. One day, the cameras will stop, the audience will leave, and the judging will end. What will remain is the boy who resisted every rule, the man who spent decades shaping other people's futures, and the father who learned that his own life was waiting beyond the studio. If Simon Cowell ever made you believe that an ordinary person could step into the light, leave a few words below in tribute to the man behind the judging table. You may also honor his journey with a like. Share this story with someone who remembers those unforgettable television nights, and subscribe so we can continue preserving the lives, losses, and legacies of the stars who shaped our memories.